In a world where appearances deceive and first impressions can be deadly wrong, one man learned the hardest lesson of his life in less than 3 seconds. What started as what he thought would be an easy target became a nightmare that would haunt him forever. Because sometimes the person you think is vulnerable is actually the one who trained the most dangerous warriors in the world. This is the story of Marcus Chun, a petty criminal who thought he had found the perfect victim, and Sarah Iron Hawk Rodriguez, a woman whose gentle appearance masked a training background that had forged Navy SEALs into weapons of precision and power. When their worlds collided on a quiet San Diego street, neither of their lives would ever be the same. What happens when unstoppable force meets immovable object? What occurs when a predator discovers his prey is actually the apex predator? This is that story, raw, unfiltered, and absolutely true. The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot of the Coronado Beach Shopping Center as Sarah Rodriguez stepped out of her silver Honda Civic. To anyone watching, she appeared to be just another woman in her late 30s, dressed in simple jeans and a loose-fitting gray sweatshirt, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Her movements were fluid but unremarkable, the kind of person who blended seamlessly into any crowd. She carried a small purse and walked with the unhurried pace of someone running weekend errands. What observers couldn't see was the way her eyes constantly scanned her surroundings, noting exit points, potential threats, and escape routes with the automatic precision of someone whose survival had once depended on such awareness. They couldn't detect the controlled breathing that kept her heart rate steady, or the way her seemingly relaxed posture was actually a perfectly balanced stance that could shift into defensive positioning in a fraction of a second. Marcus Chun had been watching her for nearly 10 minutes from his position near the coffee shop entrance. At 28, Marcus had developed what he considered a keen eye for potential targets. He preferred women who appeared distracted, well-dressed enough to carry cash or expensive items, and, most importantly, those who looked like they wouldn't put up much of a fight. Sarah Rodriguez checked all his boxes perfectly. Marcus had fallen into criminal behavior almost by accident 3 years earlier. After losing his job at a tech startup, he had initially turned to petty theft out of desperation. But when his first few attempts proved surprisingly easy and profitable, desperation had morphed into something darker. He had convinced himself that he was simply redistributing wealth from those who had plenty to spare to someone who truly needed it. The rationalization helped him sleep at night, even as his methods became more aggressive. His technique was simple but effective. He would follow targets to isolated areas, usually parking lots or quiet streets, then approach aggressively and demand valuables. Most people, shocked by the sudden confrontation, would comply immediately. Marcus had learned that the key was projecting confidence and aggression while targeting individuals who seemed unlikely to resist. In 3 years, he had never encountered serious opposition. Sarah finished loading her groceries into the trunk of her car and began pushing the empty cart toward the designated return area. This was exactly the kind of moment Marcus looked for. His target would be briefly distracted, focused on a simple task with her back turned and her guard down. The parking lot was relatively empty, with the closest shoppers at least 50 yards away. Perfect conditions. What Marcus didn't know was that Sarah Rodriguez had spent the last 15 years as one of the most respected combat instructors in the United States military. Her official title was Senior Combat Training Specialist, but among the Navy SEALs she had trained, she was known simply as Iron Hawk, a nickname earned through years of pushing elite warriors beyond their perceived limitations. Sarah's journey to this position had been anything but conventional. Born to immigrant parents in East Los Angeles, she had grown up in a neighborhood where physical toughness wasn't optional. It was survival. Her father, a former boxer from Mexico, had taught her to fight not because he wanted his daughter to be violent, but because he understood that strength was often the only language bullies understood. When Sarah joined the military at 18, she had initially planned to serve a single tour and use the GI Bill to attend college. But her exceptional performance in basic training and advanced combat courses caught the attention of special operations recruiters. By 22, she was one of the youngest instructors ever assigned to train Navy SEAL candidates at the Basic Underwater Demolition School in Coronado. The SEALs have been skeptical at first. Many of these elite warriors struggled with the idea of taking orders from a woman, especially one who looked more like a college student than a hardened military instructor. That skepticism lasted exactly until Sarah's first demonstration class, where she systematically dismantled 3 separate volunteers in hand-to-hand combat, each engagement lasting less than 30 seconds. What made Sarah truly exceptional wasn't just her physical capabilities, though those were considerable. It was her ability to read opponents, to identify weaknesses, and exploit them with surgical precision. She had an almost supernatural awareness of spatial relationships, timing, and leverage that allowed her to defeat opponents who outweighed her by 60 or 70 pounds. More importantly, she could teach these skills to others. Over the years, Sarah had trained over 2,000 Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, and other special operations personnel. Her methods were unconventional but devastatingly effective. She emphasized mental preparation as much as physical technique, teaching warriors to maintain calm focus under extreme stress. Many of her former students credited her training with saving their lives in combat situations around the world. But on this particular Saturday morning, Sarah was simply Sarah, a woman enjoying a rare day off, running errands, and looking forward to a quiet afternoon reading in her garden. She had deliberately chosen civilian clothes and was making a conscious effort to relax, to let her guard down, and simply exist as a normal person for a few hours. As she approached the cart return area, Sarah felt rather than saw the presence behind her. Years of training had honed her peripheral awareness to an extraordinary degree, and something about the footsteps following her triggered an automatic alert in her subconscious. The pace was wrong, too deliberate, too focused. The person was matching her speed rather than passing by, staying just outside her direct line of sight. She continued her normal movement pattern while her mind rapidly assessed the situation. The footsteps belonged to a male, approximately 5'10" based on stride length, moving with the confidence of someone who believed they had the advantage of surprise. She could hear the slight shuffle that indicated tennis shoes rather than boots, and the even breathing pattern suggested someone who was nervous but trying to control it. Marcus closed the distance between them, his heart rate increasing as he prepared to make his move. He had played this scenario out in his mind dozens of times, and everything was proceeding exactly according to plan. The woman was alone, distracted, and completely unaware of his presence. He would grab her arm, spin her around, and make his demands before she had time to react or call for help. He reached out with his right hand, aiming for her shoulder, intending to spin her around and intimidate her with his size and aggressive posture. His fingers were inches from making contact when Sarah moved. The movement was so subtle and so fast that Marcus's brain initially couldn't process what had happened. One moment he was reaching for what he assumed was an easy target, and the next moment he was stumbling forward off balance, as his intended victim seemed to simply vanish from where she had been standing. Sarah had detected the change in air pressure as Marcus's hand approached, and her body had reacted with trained precision. She had shifted her weight to her left foot and pivoted clockwise, allowing Marcus's reaching hand to pass harmlessly through the space where she had been standing a fraction of a second earlier. The movement was so economical and so perfectly timed that to an outside observer, it might have appeared that Marcus had simply missed his target due to clumsiness. But Marcus knew better. As he stumbled past where Sarah had been, fighting to regain his balance, he caught a glimpse of her face. What he saw there made his blood run cold. There was no fear, no surprise, no confusion. Instead, Sarah was looking at him with the calm, analytical expression of a professional evaluating a problem that needed to be solved. For the first time in 3 years of criminal activity, Marcus felt genuine fear. This was not going according to plan. This woman had not only avoided his grab, but had done so with a skill and precision that suggested serious training. Worse, she was now facing him directly, and Marcus could see in her posture that she was not preparing to run or comply with demands. She was preparing to fight. Sarah's mind was operating on multiple levels simultaneously. Part of her consciousness was cataloging everything about her attacker: his approximate height and weight, the way he favored his right side, the tension in his shoulders that suggested limited formal fighting experience, the slight tremor in his hands that indicated adrenaline and nervousness. Another part was analyzing the environment, noting the concrete barriers that could be used for leverage, the open spaces for maneuvering, and the potential for collateral damage to innocent bystanders. But the largest part of her awareness was simply calm, focused presence. This was a situation she had trained for thousands of times, both in controlled environments and in real-world deployments. Her body knew what to do without conscious direction, and her mind was free to focus on strategy and timing. Marcus attempted to recover his initiative by lunging forward again, this time abandoning subtlety in favor of brute force. He was bigger and stronger than this woman, and he was confident that if he could just get his hands on her, the situation would return to familiar territory. He was about to learn just how wrong he could be. As Marcus charged forward, Sarah stepped into his attack rather than away from it. This counterintuitive movement caught him completely off guard and positioned her inside his reach, where his size advantage became a liability rather than an asset. Before Marcus could adjust his attack, Sarah had grabbed his extended arm and used his own momentum against him. The technique she employed was a classic jiu-jitsu throw called Ippon Sui Nage, or one-arm shoulder throw. By gripping Marcus's right wrist with her left hand and his upper arm with her right, then pivoting and dropping her center of gravity while pulling him forward, Sarah was able to use physics and leverage to completely overcome the disparity in their sizes. Marcus found himself flying through the air with a force and speed that seemed impossible. The woman he had thought was an easy target had somehow turned his own charge against him, and now he was hurtling toward the concrete with no way to control his landing. He hit the ground hard, the impact driving the air from his lungs and sending sharp pains through his shoulder and ribs. For several seconds, he couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't even think clearly. When his vision finally cleared, he found himself looking up at the woman, who was standing over him with the same calm expression she had worn throughout the entire encounter. Sarah observed her attacker as he struggled to regain his breath and composure. She could see that he was more shocked than seriously injured, though he would certainly be sore for several days. More importantly, she could see that his aggressive confidence had been completely shattered. The man who had approached her with predatory intent was now looking at her with a mixture of fear and confusion that told her the immediate threat had passed. But Sarah also recognized that this situation was far from over. She had defended herself successfully, but now she faced a choice about how to proceed. She could simply walk away and let Marcus learn from his mistake, or she could take steps to ensure that he never threatened anyone else again. As she considered her options, Sarah became aware that their confrontation had attracted attention. Several shoppers had stopped to stare, and she could see someone in the distance holding up a phone, likely recording the incident. In the age of social media, any physical altercation had the potential to become viral video content, often with important context lost in the editing. Marcus, meanwhile, was beginning to understand just how badly he had miscalculated. The woman standing over him was not just someone who had gotten lucky. She was clearly a trained fighter with skills far beyond anything he had ever encountered. The casual efficiency with which she had dismantled his attack suggested military or law enforcement background, which meant this situation could become much more complicated than a simple mugging gone wrong. He attempted to scramble to his feet, thinking only of escape, but found his body wasn't responding as quickly as his brain demanded. The throw had rattled him more than he had initially realized, and his coordination was still compromised. As he struggled to stand, Sarah spoke for the first time. Her voice was quiet but carried easily across the space between them. There was no anger in her tone, no satisfaction at having defeated an attacker. Instead, she spoke with the matter-of-fact professionalism of someone dealing with an unfortunate but not uncommon situation. The words she spoke would echo in Marcus's mind for years to come, marking the moment when his life took a dramatic turn towards something he had never imagined possible. But, more than her words, it was the complete absence of fear or uncertainty in her demeanor that truly drove home to Marcus just how far out of his depth he had wandered. As sirens began to sound in the distance, both Sarah and Marcus realized that their brief encounter was about to become something much larger and more complex than either had anticipated. The police had been called, witnesses were gathering, and soon there would be reports to file and questions to answer. For Marcus, this represented the end of his criminal career and quite possibly his freedom. For Sarah, it meant that her carefully guarded anonymity was about to be shattered, and her extraordinary background would likely become public knowledge. Neither of them could have predicted how profoundly this moment would change not just their own lives, but the lives of countless others who would eventually hear their story. Detective Maria Santos arrived on scene within minutes of the initial call, her unmarked Crown Victoria pulling into the shopping center parking lot just as the first patrol units were establishing a perimeter around the incident area. Santos had been with the San Diego Police Department for 12 years, specializing in assault cases, and had developed a reputation for quickly cutting through conflicting witness statements to determine what had actually happened. What she found at the scene immediately caught her attention. Instead of the typical aftermath of a violent confrontation, injured parties, emotional witnesses, and chaotic statements, she encountered an almost surreal calm. The alleged victim, a petite woman in her late 30s, was sitting quietly on a concrete barrier, answering questions from Officer Johnson with the same composure most people displayed when discussing the weather. The alleged attacker, a man roughly twice her size, was receiving medical attention from paramedics, but appeared to be suffering more from shock than from any serious physical injuries. Marcus Chun sat in the back of the ambulance, staring blankly ahead while EMT Rodriguez checked his pupils for signs of concussion. The medical examination revealed some bruising on his shoulder and ribs consistent with a hard fall, but no broken bones or serious trauma. What concerned the paramedic more was Marcus's psychological state. He seemed to be experiencing some form of dissociative episode, responding to questions with delayed, confused answers. Detective Santos approached Sarah first, introducing herself and asking for a basic account of what had occurred. Sarah's statement was clear, concise, and delivered without any of the emotional overlay that typically accompanied accounts of violent encounters. She explained that she had been returning a shopping cart when she became aware of someone approaching her from behind with apparent aggressive intent. When the individual attempted to grab her, she had defended herself using minimal necessary force. What struck Santos immediately was Sarah's terminology. Most civilians described physical confrontations in emotional terms. They felt scared, surprised, or angry. They used vague language about struggling or fighting back. Sarah, by contrast, spoke with the clinical precision of someone providing a tactical briefing. She used specific terms like approach from 6 o'clock position and executed a defensive counter to neutralize the threat. This was not the vocabulary of an ordinary citizen who had gotten lucky in a dangerous situation. Santos asked Sarah to walk her through the incident step by step, and what emerged was an account of someone who had maintained complete situational awareness throughout the encounter. Sarah could describe not just what she had done, but why she had chosen each specific action. She explained how she had detected the approach based on footstep patterns and changes in ambient sound. She detailed her decision to pivot rather than retreat, her analysis of the attacker's body language and positioning, and her selection of a throwing technique that would neutralize the threat without causing permanent injury. When Santos asked about Sarah's background, she received another surprise. Most people in Sarah's situation would immediately volunteer information about any training or experience that might explain their actions. Sarah, however, simply stated that she worked for the Department of Defense and was not authorized to discuss the specifics of her position without proper clearance. This response triggered several red flags for Detective Santos. In her experience, people who cited security clearances and authorization protocols were usually involved in classified military or intelligence work. Such individuals often possess combat training far beyond what civilian self-defense courses provided. Santos made a note to contact the appropriate military liaisons to verify Sarah's background and determine if there were any security implications to the incident. Meanwhile, Marcus was beginning to recover his composure enough to provide his own statement. What he told Officer Williams painted a very different picture from what anyone had expected. Rather than claiming innocence or making excuses, Marcus immediately confessed to attempted robbery. He admitted that he had targeted Sarah because she appeared to be an easy victim, and he acknowledged that his intent had been to intimidate her into surrendering her valuables. What made Marcus's statement remarkable was not his confession. Criminals sometimes admitted guilt when caught in obvious circumstances. It was his description of what had actually happened during the encounter. According to Marcus, Sarah had not simply defended herself reactively. Instead, she had demonstrated a level of combat skill that seemed almost superhuman. Marcus described how Sarah had seemed to know he was approaching before he had even made physical contact. He talked about the way she had moved, not just avoiding his grab, but positioning herself strategically to use his own momentum against him. Most unsettling to Marcus was his realization that Sarah could have seriously injured him if she had chosen to do so, but had instead used exactly the amount of force necessary to neutralize his threat without causing permanent damage. Officer Williams initially dismissed much of Marcus's account as the confused recollections of someone who had suffered a traumatic experience. Criminals often developed elaborate explanations for their failures, and it seemed more likely that Marcus had simply tripped or fallen while attempting to assault Sarah. But as Williams compared Marcus's statement with the accounts provided by witnesses, a consistent picture began to emerge that supported even the most dramatic elements of Marcus's story. 3 separate witnesses had observed the encounter from different angles, and all described the same sequence of events. Sarah had somehow detected Marcus's approach and evaded his initial grab with what appeared to be trained precision. She had then executed what one witness described as something you'd see in a martial arts movie to throw Marcus several feet through the air. Most tellingly, all witnesses agreed that Sarah had remained completely calm throughout the encounter, showing no signs of fear or surprise. Detective Santos realized she was dealing with something well outside the normal parameters of a street crime. The evidence suggested that Marcus had indeed attempted to assault Sarah, but that Sarah possessed combat training sophisticated enough to neutralize a larger attacker with minimal effort. The implications were significant not just for the criminal case against Marcus, but potentially for ongoing investigations into other unsolved assaults in the area. Santos decided to contact Lieutenant Colonel David Martinez, her liaison with the military police at Naval Base Coronado. If Sarah was indeed affiliated with special operations training programs, Martinez would be able to provide background information while respecting any necessary security protocols. The phone call to Lieutenant Colonel Martinez proved to be enlightening in ways Santos hadn't anticipated. When she mentioned Sarah Rodriguez's name, there was a long pause before Martinez asked Santos to hold while he verified some information. When he returned to the line, his tone had changed from casual cooperation to something approaching reverence. According to Martinez, Sarah Rodriguez was not just any Department of Defense employee. She was Senior Combat Training Specialist Rodriguez, better known among special operations personnel as Iron Hawk. Over the past 15 years, she had trained more Navy SEALs than any other instructor in the program's history. Her reputation extended beyond just the SEALs. She had conducted training sessions for Army Rangers, Air Force pararescue teams, and various classified special operations units. Martinez explained that Sarah's expertise was not limited to basic combat techniques. She specialized in what the military called asymmetric engagement scenarios, situations where smaller, lighter fighters faced larger, stronger opponents. Her training methods have been credited with saving lives in combat zones around the world, and many of her former students had gone on to become instructors themselves. What made this information particularly significant was that Sarah's civilian identity was carefully protected. Most people, even within the military, knew her only by her call sign and had no idea what she looked like out of uniform. Her address was not listed in any public databases, and she took considerable precautions to maintain her anonymity outside of work. The fact that Marcus had randomly selected Sarah as a target was, according to Martinez, extraordinarily unlucky for Marcus and potentially dangerous for Sarah. If word spread about the incident, it could compromise her security and possibly endanger ongoing classified training operations. Detective Santos found herself in the unusual position of investigating a case where the victim was significantly more dangerous than the perpetrator, and where publicity could create national security concerns. She realized that the standard procedures for processing assault cases would need to be modified to protect both Sarah's identity and the security of her military work. Back at the scene, Sarah was becoming aware that her carefully maintained cover was beginning to unravel. The questions from law enforcement were becoming more specific, and she could see recognition beginning to dawn in the eyes of some of the military personnel who had arrived as part of the response team. She knew that it was only a matter of time before someone connected her civilian identity with her military reputation. Marcus, meanwhile, was struggling to process the full implications of what he had learned about his intended victim. The paramedics had explained that Sarah worked in military training, though they hadn't provided specific details. But even this limited information was enough to make Marcus understand that he had made a mistake that went far beyond a simple failed robbery. As Marcus thought back over the encounter, he began to realize that Sarah had demonstrated restraint that probably saved his life. Someone with her level of training could have permanently disabled or even killed him before he had time to realize what was happening. Instead, she had used precisely the amount of force necessary to neutralize his threat while minimizing his injuries. This realization triggered something unexpected in Marcus, a genuine sense of gratitude toward the woman he had tried to rob. For the first time in years, he was forced to confront the reality of what his criminal behavior meant, not just for his victims, but for himself. He had been living as a predator, targeting people he perceived as weak, never considering that his assumptions might be completely wrong or that his actions might have life-altering consequences. Detective Santos made the decision to process the case with special handling protocols. Marcus would be charged with attempted robbery and assault, but the details of Sarah's background would be omitted from public records wherever possible. The witness statements would be carefully edited to focus on Marcus's actions rather than Sarah's responses, and media inquiries would be directed through official military channels. Sarah, recognizing that some level of disclosure was inevitable, decided to cooperate fully with the investigation while requesting that her personal information remain protected. She provided a detailed tactical assessment of the encounter for law enforcement use, explaining not just what had happened, but why she had chosen each specific response. Her statement revealed the depth of analysis that had occurred during those few seconds of combat. Sarah had instantly assessed Marcus's physical capabilities, his likely training level, and his psychological state. She had chosen a throwing technique that would end the confrontation decisively, while minimizing the risk of serious injury to Marcus. She had also positioned herself throughout the encounter to protect nearby civilians and minimize the chance of collateral damage. Reading Sarah's tactical analysis, Detective Santos began to understand why Navy SEALs trained under her instruction. The level of simultaneous awareness and decision-making Sarah had demonstrated under stress was extraordinary, even by the standards of professional law enforcement. As the formal investigation proceeded, word began to spread through the tight-knit special operations community about what had happened. The story of a civilian attempting to assault Iron Hawk during her time off became something of a legend, shared in training facilities and deployment zones around the world. For many of Sarah's former students, it served as a reminder of the skills their instructor possessed and the debt they owed to her training. Marcus was formally charged and released on bail, with a court date set for the following month. As he left the police station, he carried with him not just the legal consequences of his actions, but a completely transformed understanding of his own place in the world. The encounter had shattered his delusions about being a predator and forced him to confront the reality that there were levels of strength and capability he had never imagined. More importantly, it had shown him that true strength often came disguised as gentleness, and that the most dangerous people were often those who had no need to advertise their capabilities. For Sarah, the incident represented the end of an era. Her civilian anonymity was compromised, and she would need to take additional security precautions to protect both herself and her work. But she had also been reminded of why her training was so important and why the skills she taught to special operations personnel could mean the difference between life and death in real-world situations. As news of the incident spread through official channels, it reached the attention of Admiral Rebecca Thompson, commander of Naval Special Warfare Command. Thompson had been looking for ways to highlight the importance of the military's training programs and the expertise of its instructors. Sarah's encounter provided a perfect real-world demonstration of how proper training could turn what should have been a victim into someone capable of protecting themselves and others. The Admiral began to consider whether this incident might be used to illustrate the value of military training to civilian law enforcement and security agencies. If Sarah's skills could neutralize threats so effectively, there might be opportunities to share that expertise more broadly, potentially saving lives and preventing crimes throughout the civilian community. These considerations would soon transform Sarah's life in ways she had never anticipated, setting in motion a series of events that would eventually impact not just her own career, but the entire approach to civilian self-defense training across the country. 3 weeks after the parking lot incident, Marcus Chun sat in his cramped studio apartment, staring at a letter that had arrived that morning. The return address showed it was from the San Diego County Public Defender's office, but the contents were unlike anything he had expected to receive. Inside was not just information about his upcoming court date, but a proposal that would fundamentally change the direction of his life. The letter explained that Sarah Rodriguez had requested a meeting with Marcus before his sentencing hearing. She wanted to discuss something called a restorative justice option that could potentially reduce his charges if he agreed to participate in a community service program she was developing. The program was designed to help individuals who had made poor choices understand the impact of their actions and develop better decision-making skills. Marcus read the letter 3 times before the full implications began to sink in. The woman he had tried to rob wanted to help him avoid jail time. Not only had she refrained from seriously injuring him during their encounter, but she was now actively working to ensure that his mistake didn't destroy his future. It was a level of compassion that Marcus had never experienced, and it forced him to confront uncomfortable questions about the person he had become. During the weeks since his arrest, Marcus had done a great deal of thinking about his life choices. The shock of discovering that his intended victim was one of the most dangerous people in the military had initially overwhelmed him. But as that shock faded, he began to examine the assumptions and rationalizations that had led him to a life of crime. Marcus realized that he had been living in a fantasy world where he was the victim of circumstances and other people were simply resources to be exploited. He had convinced himself that his targets were wealthy people who wouldn't miss whatever he took from them. But the truth was that he had never bothered to learn anything about the people he robbed. For all he knew, some of them might have been struggling financially just as he was. More disturbing was his recognition that he had been deliberately targeting people he perceived as weak or vulnerable. He had looked for victims who seemed unlikely to resist, which meant he was essentially preying on those who most needed protection. The fact that he had been completely wrong about Sarah didn't change the predatory nature of his selection criteria. The meeting with Sarah took place in a conference room at the community center near the naval base. Marcus arrived early, partly from nervousness and partly because he wanted time to compose himself. When Sarah entered the room, Marcus was struck by how different she seemed from their first encounter. In the parking lot, even in civilian clothes, there had been something intimidating about her presence. Now, dressed in a simple business suit and carrying a folder of documents, she looked more like a social worker than a combat instructor. Sarah greeted Marcus professionally but warmly, thanking him for agreeing to meet with her. She explained that she had been thinking about their encounter and had realized that it represented an opportunity to do something positive rather than simply processing it through the standard criminal justice system. According to Sarah, she had been developing a program called Strength Through Understanding that was designed to help people who had made serious mistakes rebuild their lives through service to their communities. The program combined physical training, mental conditioning, and practical life skills with volunteer work, helping others who were facing similar challenges. Sarah explained that she had seen many people throughout her military career who had started down destructive paths, but had been able to turn their lives around when given the right guidance and opportunities. She believed that Marcus's encounter with her had been a wake-up call that could serve as the foundation for genuine personal transformation. The program Sarah outlined was intensive and demanding. Participants would spend 6 months training 3 days per week, learning not just physical self-defense techniques, but also conflict resolution, emotional regulation, and leadership skills. They would then spend an additional 6 months applying those skills as mentors and instructors for at-risk youth in the community. What made the program unique was its emphasis on turning former perpetrators into protectors. Rather than simply punishing people for their mistakes, it sought to channel whatever qualities had led them into criminal behavior toward positive purposes. The aggression that had made Marcus willing to rob strangers could potentially be redirected toward protecting vulnerable people from the kinds of threats he had once posed. Marcus listened to Sarah's proposal with growing amazement. Not only was she offering him a chance to avoid jail time, but she was suggesting that he could become part of the solution to problems he had once contributed to. The idea of using his experience as a criminal to help prevent others from making similar mistakes had never occurred to him, but it made intuitive sense. Sarah was careful to explain that the program would not be easy. The physical training alone would push participants beyond their comfort zones, and the psychological work of confronting their past actions and rebuilding their self-concept would be even more challenging. She also made it clear that not everyone who started the program completed it successfully, and that failure would result in returning to the traditional criminal justice process. But for those who did complete the program, the results had been remarkable. Sarah showed Marcus testimonials from previous participants who had gone on to careers in law enforcement, social work, and community organizing. Some had started their own programs to help other former offenders, while others had simply become productive members of their communities who used their experiences to help family and friends avoid similar mistakes. Marcus asked Sarah why she was willing to invest time and effort in helping someone who had tried to rob her. Her answer was both simple and profound. She explained that her military training had taught her that the most effective way to neutralize a threat was not always to destroy it, but sometimes to convert it into an ally. A former enemy who became a friend was not just one less threat to worry about, but potentially someone who could help identify and address other threats. Sarah also admitted that the encounter had affected her more than she had initially realized. For years, she had been training elite warriors for deployment to dangerous places around the world, but she had rarely thought about the threats that ordinary people faced in their daily lives. Seeing Marcus's shock when he realized what kind of person he had attacked made her understand that there were people in civilian society who posed dangers to others simply because they had never been confronted with the reality of what strength actually meant. The program Sarah was developing was designed to address this gap by providing civilians with access to the kinds of training and perspectives that military personnel took for granted. By teaching former offenders to protect rather than prey upon their communities. She hoped to create a network of people who understood both the criminal mindset and the skills necessary to counter it. Marcus left the meeting with a decision to make. He could accept Sarah's offer and commit to a year-long program that would be physically and emotionally demanding but could transform his life. Or he could proceed through the traditional court system, likely receive a jail sentence, and emerge with a criminal record but no additional tools for building a better future. The choice seemed obvious, but Marcus also recognized that accepting Sarah's offer would mean acknowledging the full extent of his past mistakes and committing to a level of personal change that felt overwhelming. It would mean giving up the identity he had constructed for himself as a victim of circumstances and taking responsibility for actively creating a better version of himself. After 3 days of consideration, Marcus contacted Sarah's office and agreed to participate in the program. The next morning, he arrived at a training facility on the naval base for his first session, not knowing what to expect but determined to see the process through. The physical aspect of the training was unlike anything Marcus had experienced. Sarah began not with combat techniques, but with basic conditioning designed to build strength, endurance, and flexibility. The exercises were challenging, but carefully designed to push participants just beyond their comfort zones without causing injury. What surprised Marcus was how much emphasis Sarah placed on breathing and mental focus. Before learning any physical techniques, participants spent hours practicing controlled breathing exercises and meditation designed to maintain calm awareness under stress. Sarah explained that physical techniques were useless if applied with panic or rage, and that true strength came from the ability to remain centered regardless of external circumstances. The psychological component of the training was even more intensive. Participants worked with counselors to examine the thought patterns and emotional reactions that had led to their criminal behavior. They practiced scenarios designed to trigger their old response patterns, then learned to recognize those triggers and choose different responses. Marcus found this aspect of the program particularly difficult. Confronting the selfishness and callousness that had characterized his criminal behavior was painful and embarrassing. But he also began to understand how those same qualities could be channeled in positive directions. The willingness to take risks that had made him a criminal could also make him an effective protector of others. As weeks turned into months, Marcus began to notice changes in himself that went far beyond physical fitness. He was sleeping better, thinking more clearly, and feeling more confident in social situations. More importantly, he was beginning to develop genuine empathy for other people, understanding their perspectives and concerns rather than seeing them simply as potential targets or obstacles. The program also introduced Marcus to other participants who had similar backgrounds but were at different stages of their transformation. Seeing people who had successfully completed the program and were now working as mentors and community leaders provided concrete evidence that genuine change was possible. One of the most impactful aspects of the program was the community service component. Participants spent time working with at-risk youth, elderly residents, and other vulnerable populations. For Marcus, this work provided direct experience with the kinds of people he had once targeted, but from the perspective of someone committed to protecting rather than exploiting them. Through this work, Marcus began to understand the real impact that crime had on communities. He saw how fear of victimization limited people's freedom and quality of life, and how even unsuccessful criminal attempts created lasting anxiety and trauma. This understanding motivated him to work even harder at developing skills that could make communities safer. Sarah monitored each participant's progress carefully, providing individual coaching and adjusting training regimens based on their specific needs and challenges. For Marcus, she focused particularly on helping him develop leadership skills, recognizing that his natural charisma could be a powerful tool for positive influence if properly directed. As Marcus approached the end of his 6-month training phase, Sarah asked him to assist with training newer participants. This transition from student to teacher marked a crucial milestone in his transformation. Teaching others required Marcus to articulate not just what he had learned, but why it mattered and how it could be applied in real-world situations. Working with new participants also forced Marcus to confront his past from a different angle. When he saw people struggling with the same justifications and rationalizations he had once used, he was able to challenge those thought patterns with the authority of someone who had lived through their consequences. The respect and gratitude that newer participants showed toward Marcus provided validation that his transformation was genuine and meaningful. People who were facing similar challenges looked to him as proof that change was possible, and their trust motivated him to continue growing and improving. As Marcus's story spread through the community, it began to attract attention from law enforcement agencies and social service organizations interested in replicating SARE's program. The idea of converting former offenders into community protectors challenged traditional assumptions about crime and punishment, but the results spoke for themselves. Marcus had not only avoided jail time and criminal conviction, but had developed into a person who actively contributed to community safety and well-being. More than that, he had become someone that others looked to for guidance and support, transforming from a source of fear into a source of strength for his community. 6 months into the community service phase of SARE's program, Marcus found himself standing in front of a room full of police officers, social workers, and community leaders preparing to deliver a presentation that would have been unimaginable to him a year earlier. The conference, titled Innovative Approaches to Community Safety, had drawn attendees from across California who were looking for new strategies to address rising crime rates and build stronger community relationships. Marcus had been invited to speak as a graduate of the Strength Through Understanding program, sharing his story and explaining how the experience had transformed his perspective on crime, community, and personal responsibility. As he looked out at the audience, he was struck by the realization that many of these same people might have arrested or prosecuted him under different circumstances. The transformation in Marcus's life had been profound and measurable. Not only had he completed SARE's rigorous training program, but he had gone on to establish himself as one of the most effective mentors working with at-risk youth in San Diego. His unique perspective as someone who had lived on both sides of the crime equation gave him credibility with young people who might dismiss advice from traditional authority figures. Marcus's presentation began with a frank account of his criminal behavior and the mindset that had driven it. He explained how he had rationalized his actions by viewing his victims as faceless resources rather than real people with their own struggles and vulnerabilities. He described the wake-up call of discovering that his intended victim was someone who could have seriously injured him, but chose instead to use minimal force and later offer him a path to rehabilitation. What made Marcus's story particularly compelling was his analysis of why traditional criminal justice approaches had failed to reach him. He explained that jail time might have temporarily prevented him from committing crimes, but would have done nothing to address the underlying attitudes and behaviors that led to criminal activity in the first place. Worse, it might have connected him with more experienced criminals and further isolated him from positive community influences. In contrast, SARE's program had addressed not just his criminal behavior, but the entire constellation of factors that had led to that behavior. The physical training had given him confidence and self-respect. The psychological counseling had helped him develop emotional regulation skills, and the community service component had connected him with people who needed protection rather than exploitation. Marcus shared specific examples of how his transformation had created positive impacts in his community. He described working with teenagers who were following similar paths to the one he had taken, helping them understand the real consequences of criminal behavior before they made irreversible mistakes. He talked about elderly residents who now felt safer in their neighborhood because they knew Marcus was looking out for them, and about local business owners who had hired program graduates because they understood the value of giving people second chances. One of the most powerful aspects of Marcus's presentation was his explanation of how the program had changed his understanding of strength and masculinity. Before his encounter with Sarah, Marcus had equated strength with the ability to intimidate and dominate others. The program had taught him that true strength lay in protecting those who couldn't protect themselves and in taking responsibility for making his community better rather than simply taking what he wanted from it. The audience response to Marcus's presentation was overwhelmingly positive, but it also raised difficult questions about how such programs could be scaled and replicated. Several police chiefs expressed interest in implementing similar initiatives in their jurisdictions, but they also raised concerns about resource requirements and public safety risks. Sarah, who was also speaking at the conference, addressed these concerns by presenting detailed data on the program's effectiveness. Over the 3 years since its inception, the Strength Through Understanding program had worked with 47 participants who had been charged with various crimes ranging from theft to assault. Of those, 39 had successfully completed the full program, and only 3 had been rearrested for any crime in the following year. More importantly, program graduates had contributed over 15,000 hours of community service, mentored more than 200 at-risk youth, and helped establish similar programs in 4 other cities. The return on investment, measured both in reduced incarceration costs and increased community safety, was remarkable. Sarah explained that the program's success was based on several key principles that differentiated it from traditional rehabilitation approaches. First, it treated criminal behavior as a symptom of deeper issues rather than as an isolated problem to be punished. Second, it provided participants with practical skills and genuine opportunities to contribute positively to their communities rather than simply telling them to change without giving them the tools to do so. Perhaps most importantly, the program was based on the understanding that lasting change required participants to develop internal motivation rather than simply complying with external requirements. By helping former offenders find meaning and purpose in protecting and serving others, the program created sustainable transformation that continued long after formal supervision ended. The conference presentation led to national media attention for both Sarah and Marcus. News outlets across the country picked up their story, often focusing on the dramatic irony of an attempted robber discovering his victim was a Navy SEAL trainer. But the coverage also highlighted the broader implications of their approach to criminal justice reform. Television interviews and newspaper articles brought requests from other communities to implement similar programs, as well as invitations for Sarah and Marcus to consult with law enforcement agencies and social service organizations. The attention was both gratifying and overwhelming, particularly for Sarah, who had spent her career working behind the scenes rather than in the public spotlight. The media coverage also brought the story to the attention of Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a criminologist at UC San Diego who had been studying innovative approaches to reducing recidivism rates. Dr. Walsh contacted Sarah about the possibility of conducting a formal research study on the Strength Through Understanding program to provide academic validation for what appeared to be groundbreaking results. Dr. Walsh's research proposal included following program participants for 3 years after completion, comparing their outcomes with similar offenders who went through traditional criminal justice processes. She also wanted to analyze the cost-effectiveness of the program and identify which specific components were most crucial to its success. Sarah agreed to participate in the research study, recognizing that academic validation could help expand the program's reach and influence. She also understood that rigorous evaluation would help identify areas where the program could be improved and adapted for different populations and circumstances. As the research study got underway, Marcus found himself taking on increasing responsibilities within the program. Sarah had recognized his natural leadership abilities and his unique credibility with both participants and community members, and she began training him to eventually run programs independently. This progression from participant to leader represented another crucial milestone in Marcus's transformation. He was no longer just someone who had been helped by the program. He was becoming someone who could extend that help to others. The skills he had learned as a criminal, particularly his ability to read people and understand their motivations, proved valuable in identifying participants who were genuinely committed to change versus those who were simply trying to avoid jail time. Marcus also began developing his own innovations within the program structure. He created peer mentoring circles where participants could support each other through difficult moments in their transformation process. He established partnerships with local employers who were willing to hire program graduates, helping them build legitimate careers that provided both income and self-respect. Perhaps most significantly, Marcus began working with victims of crimes similar to those he had committed. This work was emotionally challenging for everyone involved, but it provided powerful opportunities for healing and understanding on both sides. Victims were able to see that offenders could genuinely change and become forces for good in their communities, while Marcus gained deeper insight into the lasting impact of criminal behavior. One particularly meaningful experience involved Marcus meeting with Mrs. Elena Rodriguez, an elderly woman who had been robbed outside a grocery store 2 years earlier by someone matching his description and methods. The meeting was facilitated through a victim-offender reconciliation program, and both participants were supported by trained counselors throughout the process. Mrs. Rodriguez had initially been skeptical about meeting with Marcus, but she agreed because she wanted to understand why someone would target an elderly person for robbery. She had been afraid to go shopping alone since the incident and wanted to find some way to move past her fear. The meeting was difficult for both participants. Mrs. Rodriguez described how the robbery had affected not just her sense of safety, but her entire relationship with her community. She had stopped participating in activities she enjoyed and had become isolated from friends and neighbors out of fear that she might be targeted again. Marcus listened to her account with growing understanding of how his past actions had rippled outward to affect not just direct victims, but entire communities. He apologized for the fear and isolation she had experienced, acknowledging that his criminal behavior had contributed to an environment where elderly people couldn't feel safe in their own neighborhoods. But the meeting also provided an opportunity for healing. Marcus was able to describe the transformation he had undergone and his current work protecting people like Mrs. Rodriguez from the kinds of threats he had once posed. More importantly, he was able to connect her with other program graduates who were working to make their neighborhood safer. Over the following months, Mrs. Rodriguez became one of the program's strongest supporters. She began attending community meetings where program graduates spoke about their experiences, and she volunteered to help with fundraising efforts to expand the program. Her transformation from victim to advocate demonstrated the healing potential that existed when offenders and communities worked together towards shared goals. The relationship between Marcus and Mrs. Rodriguez became a model for how restorative justice principles could be applied within the strength through understanding framework. Rather than simply punishing offenders or helping them avoid consequences, the program created opportunities for genuine accountability and community healing. As word spread about these innovative approaches, Sarah and Marcus found themselves consulting with communities across the country that wanted to implement similar programs. Each consultation provided opportunities to refine and improve their methods, adapting the core principles to different local circumstances and populations. The program's success also attracted the attention of federal policymakers who were looking for evidence-based approaches to criminal justice reform. Representatives from the Department of Justice visited San Diego to observe the program in action and consider how its principles might be incorporated into national policy initiatives. Through all of this growth and recognition, Sarah remained focused on the core mission of transforming individuals and communities. She understood that media attention and political interest could be valuable for expanding the program's reach, but she also knew that sustainable change happened one person at a time through patient, dedicated work with each participant. Marcus, meanwhile, was preparing to open the first satellite location of the Strength Through Understanding program in Los Angeles. The new facility would serve a much larger and more diverse population, providing opportunities to test whether the program's principles could be effective across different cultural and economic contexts. As he prepared for this new challenge, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. Less than 2 years earlier, he had been a predator targeting vulnerable people for personal gain. Now, he was preparing to lead a program dedicated to protecting those same vulnerable populations and transforming other former predators into protectors. The transformation seemed almost miraculous, but Marcus understood that it had been the result of hard work, genuine commitment, and, most importantly, the willingness of someone like Sarah to see potential for good in even the most unlikely places. The encounter that had started as an attempted robbery had become the foundation for a movement that was changing how communities thought about crime, punishment, and redemption. 2 years after opening the Los Angeles branch of the Strength Through Understanding program, Marcus stood before the largest audience of his life in the main auditorium of the Ronald Reagan Federal Building in Washington, D.C. The National Conference on Criminal Justice Innovation had drawn representatives from every state, along with federal policymakers, academic researchers, and community leaders from across the country. The journey from attempted robber to keynote speaker and national conference still seemed surreal to Marcus, but the statistics and stories he was about to share were undeniably real. The program that had started with his encounter with Sarah in a San Diego parking lot had now been implemented in 37 cities across 15 states, with waiting lists for participation in every location. Dr. Jennifer Walsh's comprehensive research study had been completed and published in the Journal of Criminal Justice, providing academic validation for what practitioners had observed firsthand. The study tracked 247 participants across multiple program locations for 3 years after completion, comparing their outcomes with matched control groups who had gone through traditional criminal justice processes. The results were remarkable by any measure. Program participants showed a recidivism rate of just 8% compared to 63% for the control group. More importantly, 89% of program graduates had found stable employment within 6 months of completion, and 76% reported improved relationships with family members and community connections. But the numbers only told part of the story. Marcus had spent the morning before his keynote presentation meeting with federal officials who were considering legislation to provide funding for restorative justice programs based on the Strength Through Understanding model. The conversations had revealed how profoundly the program had challenged conventional thinking about crime, punishment, and rehabilitation. Senator Patricia Williams of Ohio, who chaired the Senate Judiciary Subcommittee on Crime and Community Safety, had told Marcus that his story represented everything she believed was possible when society chose to invest in transformation rather than just punishment. She was sponsoring the Community Transformation and Public Safety Act, which would provide federal grants to communities implementing evidence-based restorative justice programs. The legislation faced significant political challenges, as many constituents remained skeptical about approaches that seemed to prioritize helping offenders over punishing them. But the accumulating evidence of the program's effectiveness, combined with its cost savings compared to traditional incarceration, was building support across party lines. Marcus began his keynote address by acknowledging that 3 years earlier, many people in the audience would have seen him as exactly the kind of threat their communities needed protection from. He described his criminal mindset and behavior without minimizing or excusing it, emphasizing that accountability remained a crucial component of any effective intervention. But he also explained how traditional approaches to criminal justice had failed to address the underlying issues that led to his criminal behavior. Jail time would have temporarily removed him from the community, but would have done nothing to change his attitudes, develop his skills, or connect him with positive influences. When released, he would likely have been more alienated from mainstream society and potentially more dangerous than before. The transformation process he had undergone through Sarah's program addressed not just his criminal behavior, but the entire constellation of factors that had contributed to it. The physical training had built his self-confidence and discipline. The psychological counseling had helped him develop emotional regulation and empathy. The community service component had shown him the satisfaction that came from contributing positively to other people's lives. Marcus shared specific examples of how program graduates were making their communities safer and stronger. In Detroit, former gang members were now working as community mediators, helping resolve conflicts before they escalated into violence. In Phoenix, a group of former burglars had started a home security consulting business that helped elderly residents protect their property while also providing legitimate employment for program participants. In Houston, program graduate Maria Santos had established a nonprofit organization that provided emergency assistance to families affected by crime. Her experience as both a former offender and crime victim gave her unique insight into the needs of all parties involved in criminal incidents. Her organization had helped over 500 families access resources for counseling, financial assistance, and safety planning. These examples illustrated how the program's impact extended far beyond individual transformation to create positive ripple effects throughout entire communities. Former offenders weren't just avoiding future crimes. They were actively working to prevent crime and support other community members. Marcus also addressed some of the criticism and challenges the program had faced as it expanded. Some law enforcement officials had initially been skeptical about working with former criminals, concerned that lenient approaches would encourage more criminal behavior. Some community members had worried about having former offenders working in their neighborhoods, even in helping roles. The program had addressed these concerns through careful screening and ongoing monitoring of participants, transparent communication with communities, and consistent demonstration of positive results. Police departments that had initially been reluctant partners had become strong supporters as they saw crime rates decline in areas where program graduates were active. Community acceptance had grown as residents saw former offenders taking responsibility for improving neighborhood safety rather than simply avoiding responsibility for past crimes. The sight of people like Marcus organizing neighborhood watch programs, teaching self-defense classes to vulnerable residents, and mentoring at-risk youth had gradually changed perceptions about what redemption could look like. Sarah, who was also speaking at the conference, presented data showing how the program's principles were being adapted for different populations and contexts. Military veterans struggling with reintegration were finding success with modified versions that emphasized their existing training and leadership skills. Young people aging out of foster care were benefiting from programs that addressed their lack of family support and life skills. Even more encouraging were early results from prevention programs that applied the same principles to at-risk youth before they became involved in criminal activity. By teaching young people the same conflict resolution, emotional regulation, and community service skills that helped reform former offenders, communities were beginning to prevent crime rather than just responding to it after the fact. The conference also featured presentations from program participants who had gone on to careers in law enforcement, social work, and community organizing. Their stories demonstrated that transformation could be so complete that former offenders could become trusted community leaders and even authority figures. Officer David Martinez of the San Diego Police Department had been one of Sarah's first program participants after being arrested for assault during a bar fight. Through the program, he had learned to channel his aggressive tendencies toward protecting others and had eventually been recruited by the police department specifically because of his understanding of criminal mindset and his credibility with at-risk populations. Social worker Jennifer Thompson had completed the program after being convicted of theft to support a drug addiction. Her experience with both criminal behavior and recovery had made her an exceptionally effective counselor for clients facing similar challenges. She now supervised a team of counselors, many of whom were also program graduates. These career progressions illustrated how the program's impact could multiply over time as graduates became leaders who could help expand and improve interventions for future participants. The network of program alumni was creating a self-sustaining community of people committed to transformation and service. During the question and answer session following his presentation, Marcus was asked about the moment that had changed everything, his encounter with Sarah in the parking lot. He explained that while the physical confrontation had certainly gotten his attention, the real transformation had begun when Sarah chose to see potential for good in someone who had just tried to harm her. That choice had challenged everything Marcus thought he understood about human nature and social relationships. It had shown him that strength could be expressed through compassion rather than dominance, and that true power lay in building others up rather than tearing them down. Marcus also credited Sarah with understanding that lasting change required more than just pointing out what was wrong with someone's behavior. She had provided him with concrete skills, meaningful opportunities to contribute, and, most importantly, a community of people who supported his transformation while holding him accountable for continued growth. The audience's response to Marcus's presentation was overwhelmingly positive, but it also generated intense discussion about how such programs could be implemented more widely. Questions arose about funding sources, staff training requirements, and political challenges in communities where restorative justice approaches were viewed with suspicion. Sarah addressed many of these practical concerns, emphasizing that successful programs required careful planning, adequate resources, and strong partnerships between law enforcement, social services, and community organizations. She also stressed that programs needed to be adapted to local conditions rather than simply replicated exactly from other locations. The conference concluded with the announcement of a new federal initiative to fund demonstration projects in 20 additional cities, with technical assistance provided by experienced programs like Strength Through Understanding. The initiative would also support research to identify which program components were most essential and how they could be most effectively combined for different populations. As Marcus prepared to return to Los Angeles, he reflected on how far he had traveled, not just geographically, but personally and professionally. The scared, angry young man who had tried to rob Sarah had been replaced by someone who was helping shape national policy on criminal justice reform. But perhaps more importantly, Marcus knew that his story was just one example of what was possible when society chose to invest in transformation rather than just punishment. Across the country, other former offenders were discovering their own capacity for positive change, and communities were becoming safer and stronger as a result. The program that had started with a chance encounter in a parking lot had grown into a movement that was fundamentally changing how America thought about crime, justice, and redemption. Sarah's decision to see potential for good in someone who had tried to harm her had created ripple effects that were now reaching every corner of the country. As Marcus boarded his flight back to California, he carried with him not just his own transformed life, but the responsibility of continuing to expand and improve programs that could transform countless other lives. The work was far from finished, but the foundation had been laid for a new approach to community safety based on healing rather than just punishment. 3 months later, Marcus received a call that brought his journey full circle. The caller was James Peterson, a young man who had attempted to rob an elderly woman outside a grocery store in Sacramento. The woman, Mrs. Chun, had successfully defended herself using techniques she had learned in a community self-defense class taught by a Strength Through Understanding graduate. James was now facing criminal charges, but Mrs. Chun had heard about the program and requested that he be given the opportunity to participate rather than simply going to jail. She explained that she didn't want revenge. She wanted to know that other elderly people wouldn't face the same threat James had posed to her. As Marcus prepared to meet with James for his intake interview, he was struck by how the circle was completing itself. Someone who had once been in exactly James's position was now in a position to offer the same opportunity for transformation that Sarah had offered him. The encounter that had begun with an attempted robbery in a San Diego parking lot had become a legacy that would continue to transform lives and communities for generations to come. And at the heart of that legacy was the simple but revolutionary idea that even the most unlikely people could become forces for good when given the right support, training, and opportunities to serve others. Marcus understood that his work was no longer about his own redemption. It was about ensuring that others would have the same chances for transformation that had saved his life and given him purpose. The program would continue to grow and evolve, but its core mission would remain the same: turning predators into protectors, one person at a time.